workshop in May. But when the COVID-19 hit, we knew that we had to change our plans. And so as Heather and I were discussing postponing and what next steps might be, we also started talking about the pressure and stress that you as leaders are under during this time. And she asked if there was a way that she could help. And that's kind of how this series came about. So we're really grateful for Heather and for her generously donating her expertise and helping to lead us through practices that will help you live and lead well during these uncertain and challenging times. I also want to let you know that we have Leanne Napoleon and Molly Klein from the ACT team who are going to be working behind the scenes. And so if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and we will monitor that as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Brandy. I feel like I have such a friend in you,
You too.
extending this offer to me and making me feel so warmly welcomed. Thank you so much to you and the ACT team doing such great work in our community of Alexandria. I don't know where you all are participating from, whether it's your office or your bedroom, the kitchen table, your home office, or like me, maybe you're in a storage room in your basement. And I want to thank you so much for making the time to join us today. I hope that this series of conversations where we touch on some strategies and practices for leading and living well during anxious times supports you, really resources you. And before we begin, I want to just give you a personal acknowledgement and thank you as a resident of Alexandria for the extraordinary leadership and work that you and your teams and organizations do for the most vulnerable in our community. Those people who are being hit hardest by this frightening pandemic that's turned all of our lives upside down. But you all are the unsung heroes, the champions who are at the front lines, supporting the communities who are most in need in Alexandria. And I'm so grateful to you as a resident of Alexandria. So here we are, 8 weeks, 9 weeks in, and we're essentially living in what I would describe as a radical form of VUCA. Some of you might be familiar with this expression VUCA. It originated actually back in the 1980s out of the US Army War College to describe the post-Cold War era. And now I think we're living in an amped up version of VUCA. We could say that the environment, the climate that we're living and leading in is volatile. Change is happening so rapidly. I know for you as frontline leaders of nonprofits, you're trying to figure out what's next, what just happened, how do you prepare and plan for what's about to come, not even knowing what that might be, because the environment we live in is uncertain. We really cannot predict the future with any degree of probability. Since this all emerged about 9 weeks ago or so, things have become much more complex and complicated. The challenges that we're facing into are hard to wrap our heads around, and we see ourselves swimming in a sea of ambiguity. So the kinds of challenges and problems that have emerged, like where do you get PPEs? How do you budget for the unknown? That lends itself to a level of complexity for which there are not a lot of surefire answers or plans for. So we're living in an environment that's highly ambiguous. And then you overlay that with the fact that simultaneously, this particular event is putting some of our our basic human needs at risk. And this is true for you as well as for the communities that you serve. So we could say that our need for emotional and physical safety and security has been put at risk. Even needs as basic as food. Will there be enough food? How will we get our food? That has been squeezed with this particular event. And then of course, we have a fundamental human need for connection. And we are physically distancing ourselves in many cases from one another. We know that we are at our best when we are in close physical proximity to one another, when we are touching one another metaphorically and literally, that oxytocin, that tend and befriend hormone that's so essential to feelings of goodwill and ease, there's less of that activated when we are physically distant from one another. And then we have a fundamental human need around rest, around restoration. And a recent survey that was described on NPR suggested that at least a third of respondents are suggesting that they are losing sleep over the economic impact and distress related to this pandemic. Many of my clients are reporting difficulty sleeping. And then finally, we do have a basic human need around novelty. We as humans crave some variability in our daily experience. And living in a much more restricted way is really putting this basic human need of novelty at risk. I was talking to a client recently who is at home working full time with her 18-month-old. Every day feels largely the same. She can't see even her parents who live around the corner. And she said every day feels like an episode or a version of Groundhog Day, if you're familiar with that movie with Bill Murray, reliving the same day over and over again. So here we are, living in this VUCA environment in a situation that has put our basic human needs at risk. And we might just take actually a moment here to collectively take a few deeper breaths. You might just find your breath right now and just allow yourself to breathe in consciously a few times here together and with me. And I would suggest that one of the strategies to facing into this VUCA world with a little bit less stress and strain is really about learning how to lead and live well, even in the face of anxious times. And I would suggest to you that this first conversation we're going to have around recognizing and working well with our own reactivity, as well as the reactivity of others, is a fundamental skill for facing into and leading and living well in anxious times. One of the most important steps, I believe, to recognizing and working well with our own reactivity, as well as relating to the reactivity of others successfully, is tuning into our own emotional experience. Sensing into what it is we're experiencing emotionally. And if you take a look at this cartoon, not all of us are entirely familiar with what our emotional experience is. Perhaps we're just not in the habit of slowing down and paying attention to what we are experiencing emotionally. Or perhaps we grew up in an environment where it wasn't really encouraged to identify and express our emotions. And yet we know that it is fundamental to managing our own reactivity, to leading and living well in anxious times, to recognize and work more actively and skillfully with our own emotional experience. So I'd like to invite you in this moment to consider the last 8 or 9 weeks when this event, this pandemic emerged. And as you consider that time span, if you would use the chat right now to reflect on and capture and document, what have been some of the emotions that have been most prevalent for you? What are those feelings that have predominated for you over the last 7 to 8 weeks? So I invite you to use the chat now to capture those and document those feelings, whatever they might be. And if you take the next minute or so to do that, I'd appreciate it. So Molly, what are we seeing in the chat? Are people documenting some of what they've been experiencing?
So far, no one has responded. Oh, we have anxiety, sadness, gratitude, tiredness, and then frustration, anger, and desperation.
Yeah, wow, really the range, isn't it? It might be helpful to just take a look at what's being documented in the chat. And in some ways, there's some comfort or support in knowing that your experience is shared by others. And I suspect you're moving so quickly to address the more desperate needs in the community that you serve, that just pausing, acknowledging, and finding some support in a shared emotional experience may be a newer experience for you. One of the emotions that many of my clients, as I'm working with leaders in a variety of different organizations during this time, one of the emotions that they're consistently describing, that they're experiencing, is the emotion of anxiety and the behavioral manifestation of that, reactivity, in themselves and in others. And I want to make a distinction here between anxiety and fear. So fear, we could say, is a natural emotional response to a clear and present danger, an immediate danger. Anxiety, the chronic version of anxiety, as distinguishable from fear, is really a natural human response, emotional response to a more imprecise, vague, and potential threat. It doesn't have the same sense of immediacy that danger does. So we're all experiencing lower or higher levels of chronic anxiety right now. And we might say that reactivity is the public face of anxiety. It's the behavioral manifestation of anxiety. Our system, our human biological system, doesn't like to be with anxiety or any difficult emotion. And so it seeks to offload that anxiety. And the public form of that anxiety is reactivity. That's the behavioral version of anxiety. I remember when I was consulting with an organization a few years ago, and one of the leaders said, "Oh, we don't have any anxiety here. In fact, we don't have any emotions here. People check their emotions at the door." I thought, "That's interesting." "Really?" I said to him, because emotions are a physiological response to a perceived opportunity or threat, internal or external. They, in other words, happen in the body and we have no control over them. They are a physiological response. So I'd like you to consider, how do you behave when you're anxious? How do you know by virtue of your behavior that you're anxious? And you might want to just take a pause here and reflect on that over the course of the last 7 or 8 weeks. When anxiety has shown up for you, what does that look like in the form of reactivity? I know for me, I get really judgmental. That's sort of my go-to strategy for offloading anxiety. I'm judgmental of myself. I'm judgmental of others. I also know that I have an inclination toward over-functioning. So as I have my young adult children home from college prematurely, I'm finding myself involved in their lives in ways that are probably not too helpful for me or for them. But it's a manifestation of my anxiety. It's the offloading of that anxiety in a form of reactivity that I would characterize as over-functioning. So it's helpful to pause and ask yourself, how do you know you're anxious? What does that look like in the form of reactivity? One of the reasons we want to pay close attention to our own experience of anxiety and reactivity is because we know by virtue of the science that when we are anxious and behaving reactively, our thinking brain goes offline. So the access to creativity, to innovative solutions, to clear thinking isn't accessible to us when we're feeling highly anxious and behaving reactively. Another reason that we want to pay attention to our own anxiety and the public face of that, reactivity, is because anxiety is its own form of contagion. Anxiety seeks to spread. Because it's uncomfortable to be with, we individually seek to offload that anxiety by spreading it to others through the form of reactive behavior. It's like a game of hot potato. And if you're familiar with that game from childhood, I played it when I was a little girl, you know that the object of the game is to get rid of the hot potato. You do not want to be stuck with the hot potato. And anxiety is the same. we want to pass it along. Now, of course, we know that as a leader, your anxiety is even more contagious than the anxiety of anyone else in the system. And so how do we stop playing the game of hot potato? And I would suggest there are two fundamental strategies for stopping the contagion of anxiety in your own human system, whether that's your family or the organization that you're leading. And that is, of course, to pay attention to your own anxiety, as we've described, and find ways to work with it more skillfully. And to also be able to relate to the anxiety of others and their reactivity more skillfully. So beyond this first step, as I mentioned, of self-management or working more skillfully with your own anxiety, is recognizing what it is you're experiencing in the way of anxiety, understanding what reactivity looks like for you. The other step I want to suggest is available to us when we're more conscious is to become an observer, to become a more astute observer of both our body and our breath. Always available to us. Both are portable. We carry them with us wherever we go. And yet we're often disconnected from anxiety as it's manifesting in the body and as it's affecting our breath. So I'd like to invite you to reflect on your own experience of anxiety in the body. As you'll recall, a few moments ago, I mentioned that emotions are a physiological response. So anxiety happens in the body, and the body is a portal for better recognizing what it is we're experiencing in the way of anxiety so we can work with it more skillfully. I would invite you to consider your own body and how anxiety manifests in your physical experience, and use the chat in the next few moments to capture where in your body do you tend to sense into or experience anxiety? If you would, just take the next few moments to capture that in the chat and share, where do you feel anxiety in your own body? And in a few moments, I'll ask Molly to report in. I'm not able to see the chat, so I'm curious what people are capturing there.
Some people are saying in the gut, stomach, the pressure in my chest and tension in shoulders, shoulders, a hunchback, rib cage, lower back, hips and shoulders.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, many of you are saying shoulders. I heard several sort of the stomach area. There are some fairly typical standard places where anxiety tends to show up in the body. And again, this is important. While we may know this intuitively, to name it explicitly, because we can't work skillfully with what we don't see. And we live in an environment where we're moving so quickly that we're often losing touch with our sight with how these experiences are happening in the body. And the body can be our friend and our partner in working more skillfully with what's showing up, but we have to be paying attention. So there are some pretty predictable places, as you described, where anxiety tends to show up. I know for some of the clients whom I work with, some have had actual forms of TMJ because they're clenching in the area of the jaw. And we know that the jaw was designed for the teeth to meet only when we're chewing. But as we experience tension, even subtle tension, that area can start to hold, clench, clamp down. So that's a place to be paying particular attention. The shoulders, many of you all mentioned. You might even just notice how you're shaped right now, even as you're participating in this webinar, and how your shoulders are shaped. When we are anxious, typically the shoulders come slightly up and forward. In a way, it's a unconscious response to anxiety. We go into a protective mode. The chest collapses, shoulders come forward and up slightly. Science seems to suggest that actually reinforces the anxiety in our body. So you might want to just take a moment now to notice how you're positioned in the way of your shoulders and upper back. See if those shoulders can drop back and down away from the neck a bit more as they were designed to do. Sometimes it's helpful as simple as it is throughout the day, to raise your shoulders up to your ears and then let them drop. And to do that several times. I have some clients who do this, ping themselves on their phone several times a day, just to remind themselves to release that anxiety and tension by making that movement with their shoulders. The way our shoulders were designed was essentially anatomically to be like a clothes hanger. So you might want to consider adding that practice into your routine daily. Some of you mentioned the area of the chest. We know that when the shoulders are able to drop back and down away from the neck a bit more, that opens up the area of the chest. And it telegraphs to others, standardly, that we're more open and approachable. But when we get anxious and that area collapses or constricts on itself, we're inadvertently telegraphing to others our own anxiety. And because you're a leader, you want to be paying attention to that, because your anxiety is more contagious than anyone else's in the system where you're leading. And then the belly. I know for me, that's the go-to indicator that I am anxious. Once I feel a clenching in the belly, I know immediately that I'm feeling some stress and anxiety. And it's an invitation to stand up so that that area expands more, and then I can breathe more deeply. And some of you mentioned as well the breath, right? So we know when we're feeling more anxious, because that fight-flight instinct, that reactivity is hooked, that our breathing tends to constrict. Generally speaking, we only use about 25% of our actual lung capacity. So imagine how much less access we have when we are anxious and we feel our breath constrict. So I want to offer a strategy. It's actually a really simple practice. I would characterize it as a micro practice, in that you don't have to set dedicated time aside to be in this practice. You can remember to do this. And this is called a 3 breaths practice. I'm borrowing this from the Search Inside Yourself curriculum that I teach in all kinds of organizations around mindfulness-based emotional intelligence. And this practice is very simple, as I said. It involves 3 very easy steps. The first is, and we call it the 3 breaths practice, because the first breath is simply about locating your breath. We even forget that we're breathing when we're anxious, right? So the first breath is to notice that you're breathing. The second breath is to relax the body. And the third breath is to ask yourself a question. And I would offer that this question, what's most important right now, can be a real catalyst for calming the sympathetic nervous system, the system that's activated when we're anxious. We might even practice right now. So on this 3 breaths micro practice, you might take a breath in. Simply notice that you're breathing. Where is it easiest to detect the fact that you're breathing? And the second breath, you might envision softening down the length of your body. And the third breath is asking yourself this question: what's most important right now? That shifts the activity in our brain out of the limbic system, or the emotional brain that gets activated when we're anxious, and shifts activity into the prefrontal cortex, or the executive functioning brain, that part of the brain that we desperately need to access more routinely when we're under pressure and need to think creatively and innovatively about solutions. So I want to suggest that when you are working on your own level of reactivity, when you're calming your sympathetic nervous system, calming your own anxiety, that in and of itself will be a potent antidote to others' reactivity around you. And even with your working on yourself, inevitably, you're going to come across people who are agitated and who are anxious themselves, and as a result are behaving reactively. And how do you relate to those people as skillfully as possible without getting anxious yourself? I want to offer a strategy called yield theory. And yield theory comes out of the research and the writings of a psychologist named Dr. Christian Conte. And he developed this theory called yield theory out of his work with inmates in prisons around anger management. And I would suggest that this theory and this framework or set of core strategies for relating successfully, more skillfully with people who are reactive is just as applicable to working with people who are anxious and behaving reactively. And I suspect, given the kind of roles that you play in our community, you're already pretty talented at this. And this is just simply a reinforcement, perhaps, of what you're already doing and practicing well. And the first strategy, as you might imagine, is listening. We say that listening really actively with our whole self, even if we're physically distant from the other person who's agitated or anxious, behaving reactively, that listening is what creates safety for that person when they feel themselves fully heard. And this is a real departure from our natural hardwiring, which is more egoic in nature. We want to listen in order to be understood ourselves, when in fact, what this strategy is really encouraging us to do, insisting that we do, is listen in order to understand the other person. And that's meaning listening fully, intently, facing into that person. Once that person feels themselves more safe, their anxiety is reduced slightly, then we can practice this core strategy of validating. And I'm not suggesting validation is a form of condoning or agreeing with the other person whose behavior may be inappropriate or who may be behaving in such a way that it's creating difficulty for others around them. What's suggested here in Dr. Conte's strategy of validating is that we're creating connection. So when we offer, reflect back, that we understand why a person might be upset, that we ask them more about why they're upset, that we reflect back or mirror back what we're witnessing in the way of their emotional reactivity or anxiety, we're actually creating connection by virtue of validating their emotional experience. And the third strategy that Dr. Conte describes is exploring. Once a person feels more safe in our presence, once their emotional experience has been validated so that they can feel connected with us, then we're better positioned to explore options with them. And in effect, this particular strategy of exploring options is really about shifting someone's activity, their neural activity, from their emotional brain to their thinking brain, which isn't possible for them when they're anxious and reactive. That's why the other two strategies or steps are so important. We can't get to exploring options until those have happened. So as we wrap up here, a quick recap of what we've touched on in our conversation today. We live in this VUCA world, and it's putting our basic human needs at risk, particularly now in ways many of us have never fully experienced before. So we're going to see more anxiety in ourselves. We're going to see more anxiety in those around us. And again, the public form of that is reactivity. Identifying our own emotional experience is essential to working with it skillfully. And we could say that the body is a pathway toward better understanding what we're experiencing emotionally, that anxiety, like every emotion, happens in the body. When we're paying attention to the body as a more neutral observer and paying attention to our breath, say through a practice like the 3 breaths practice, we are in essence practicing self-management. And when we are in the face of others' reactivity and seeking to work more skillfully with that, helping them just by virtue of our own less anxious presence, as well as this yield theory strategy, we're really helping to them to manage their own anxiety and reactivity. A couple of potential assignments, if you're interested, that I think would support the learning that we're focusing on here today and support you around leading and living well in these anxious times, is to actually ask someone who knows you well how you behave when you're anxious. How do they know that you're anxious? When I asked my husband this question, he could describe very specifically what happens on my face when I'm feeling anxious. And it's helpful to know that because there's often a gap between what others are able to see and what we're able to observe ourselves. And I would encourage you, if you don't already have a practice of taking several mindful breaths a day, that you introduce this 3 mindful breaths practice 3 times a day. You may even need to set a reminder for yourself. We're lucky to live in this age of technology to support us in that way, and to see what kind of impact that might have for you. There are a few resources here that I've captured that if you have the interest, it may not be the right time right now, but put them on your list for the future. My colleagues wrote the book Resilient Leadership 2.0. Fantastic resource, I highly recommend. The book that I mentioned by Christian Conte, who developed the yield theory, is called Walking Through Anger. And if you need some support through guided practices, I have a whole set of guided practices on my website in the resource section. So I want to thank you all so much for your attention today. I hope this has offered you some support. It's been great to be here with you. And I think we're going to open it up to some Q&A if people are interested and have some extra time. So I don't know, Molly, how you wanted to handle this piece.
Sure. We can, if you have questions, maybe the best practice would be to put them in the chat and I'll read them out loud. Oh, here's one. Do you have recommendations on how best to begin the day to reduce anxiety?
Oh, yes, I do. Thank you for the question. Is that Nancy to everybody, or not someone else? Okay.
That would be Belinda.
Yeah, I don't know the extent to which you all have some kind of daily practice related to mindfulness. For some of you, that might be yoga. For others, it might be an actual meditation practice. I've been practicing meditation as a form of mindfulness, seated meditation, for about 10 years. Have had some phenomenal teachers along the way. And now I really cannot imagine my day without it. So I personally begin the day before I exercise every day with at least 20 minutes of guided meditation by one of my favorite teachers. And during this particular time, I open the door and listen to the birds and listen to the voice of one of my most beloved teachers. And I seriously can't imagine how I would be able to face into some of the anxiety that's being provoked by this uncertainty, this VUCA world, if I didn't have that daily practice. Other clients of mine have a daily journaling practice. And some of you all might be able to offer each other some suggested practices that are routine in nature and are really building the capacity in your nervous system to be with what is showing up with a little bit less stress and strain. Maybe anybody wants to put in the chat what's serving them these days.
Some people are saying meditation, getting outside every day, daily walks, prayer, morning walks as a family.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah, you may not, some of you may be already aware of this, but I've been doing some training as a forest therapy guide, which is put on hold for the moment. And what was really astounding to me was to learn what the physiological benefits are of actually being near trees. I had no idea before I went through this training that they actually emit these volatile oils called phytoncides. And phytoncides actually have been proven based on scientific research to reduce the level of cortisol, the stress hormone in our blood. They improve heart rate variability. So in other words, our ability to recover more easily from being triggered in terms of heart rate. So we all sort of intuitively know that it feels good to be, out in the forest or near trees. And it turns out it really is good for us. And there's nothing we have to do. It's like a passive benefit. It's just by being in nature. So I'm thrilled that some of you all captured that as well.
There's another question for you here. Do you have thoughts or ideas for those of us with kids at home? This person currently has a 10-year-old, 7-year-old, and 3-year-olds.
Yeah. Well, I have some clients who've been great teachers for me recently because I have been teaching a group of high potentials in a company in Pennsylvania, and they're all younger and have young children at home. I've met many of the children through our coaching sessions. They'll show up in on the monitor. And something that they've been looking at and that I encouraged was they're spending more time, even when the weather's bad, with their children outdoors. And they engage their younger children, and you could do this with older children as well, based on their receptivity. There's a practice that I've borrowed from my forest therapy guide training, and it's a practice called What's in Motion. And a lot of my clients have really enjoyed introducing this to their kids and spending time being mindful with their kids in nature. It doesn't take long, but what they actually practice is they say to their children, we're going to spend the next 3 minutes, 5 minutes walking down this path, or being somewhere in nature that you can access easily. And we're going to watch for what's in motion. And generally you encourage everybody to slow down enough because you really have to be paying attention. And it's kind of amazing what you start to really observe that's in motion, even on a day that's really still. And we're, in this unusual springtime weather where there's a lot of breeze and there's some rain, and there are all different ways of observing what's in motion that's even more accessible in this kind of weather. I don't know if that's helpful for you. I know that another strategy a lot of coaches are turning to is, it's really more of a mental strategy when they're at home with children, and that is to reevaluate and readjust their expectations of themselves. So I work with a lot of women who tend to be really, have really high standards for themselves in the way of work and home. And it's impossible, right, to show up in exactly the same way as we did 9 weeks ago when you have children at home and you're trying to serve your community and in your leadership role. So one of the mental strategies a lot of coaches are turning to is giving themselves some grace and readjusting their expectations of what is success, right? And being mindful of that. I hope that's helpful.
And it looks like there are a couple more comments. Jackie says Heather's forest therapy is amazing. And then and then more people commented that nature walks are helpful, and then watching the news after that, following up with listening to something positive, or else having a fast from the news is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are all wonderful strategies. It's so interesting, isn't it? None of this is very complicated. It's really remembering to do these things for ourselves. And I hope that you'll rejoin next week. We're going to build on this particular conversation with a focus on cultivating a calm and centered presence, some strategies to do that. And then our final session together the following week is on compassion as an antidote for empathic distress. So I hope you all will join in. It's been great seeing you. And once again, many, many thanks for all the amazing work you're doing in our community. Where would we be without you? So please resource yourselves, take good care of yourself, and look forward to seeing you next week.